at this point. According to okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's always a great pleasure to have Mario Diani with us. As I also said in the graduate seminar we had a few days ago, Mario, a professor in the Department of Sociology and Social Research in the University of Trento, who is a distinguished scholar, both in contentious politics and in network analysis. Has been a loyal friend of the laboratory for almost 15 years now, right? So consider him one of us, a member, an actual member of the laboratory. This afternoon, Mario focuses on the big issue of unionism, which is an extremely important issue, of course, both in light of the perpetual crisis, the perma-crisis, there has been this term, and the fact that by and large, unions have been long facing their own crisis, conspicuous reduction of membership and of the confidence people have in them. In this context, Mario's research promises to shed light both on some, I imagine, hidden, in fact, I'm sure hidden aspects of the dynamics characterizing this phenomenon, as well as their complex political implications, which is obviously also very crucial. I will be commenting on the presentation myself. So by way of our traditional introduction, I will just say a word or two about two terms appearing in his title. The title is Organizational versus Social Movement Unionism, a question of embeddedness. And these two terms are social movement unionism and embeddedness. Mario obviously will have more to say on both issues, so I will keep it real brief. So just me start immediately, jump right into it. As I also said in the advertisement of the seminar, social movement unionism goes beyond the traditional focus on workplace issues like wages and working conditions, emphasizing broader social and political goals and aligning with social movements to achieve social justice issues and systemic change. Key features that in my mind stand out also include building alliances with community groups, social movements, especially the so-called new social movements, and other organizations to create broader bases of support and increase their political influence. Also, they emphasize grassroots mobilization, direct action, contentious action, and public campaigns, with an eye to challenge the so-called managerial prerogative of the workplace, seeking to empower workers to have a greater say in decision-making. Last but not least, there's also an emphasis on democratic and participatory structures against established bureaucracies. Mario distinguishes this in the abstract he submitted from organizational unionism and, of course, business unionism, which is a particular variety of organizational unionism. Turning now to embeddedness, which I think is a concept more associated with network analysis. Let me refer to the presentation that he made, a presentation on collective action fields, which he made in last year's conference, because we held the conference last year, the laboratory had the conference, and the video of that presentation is available on our YouTube channel. Well, if I'm not mistaken here, there's an orthodoxy in that area, perhaps a conventional view, if you want, which claims that union strength is a function of its membership being active in other social milieus. Whereupon union decline, wherever it occurs, is taken to reflect a limited predisposition of union members to engage in other initiatives, other groups in civil society. Of course, the question still remains whether the idea stands up to scrutiny or how much it tells us about unions' drive to increase their influence. And of course, we all look forward to hearing what Mario has to say on that issue as well. One final word, of course, is about something which is equally important, union militancy, contentious action. As Mario also put it in the abstract, nowadays there's increased radical activism among people who are neither members of any union or any other association, the disembedded people, people who are just citizens. I find this very interesting. And certainly gives us food for thought about what it means and what are the political implications of this state of affairs. But without any further ado, let me once again thank Mario for his presence, for his friendship, and for the presentation, and let me pass on the floor to him. Mario.
Thanks very much. Thanks for coming in person, so many, and thanks to those who are connected. It's really a great pleasure for me to be here, to come and visit Pantheon and friends in Athens. Let me try just to see if I can share the thing. Can you hear me from the distance properly? Yes, fantastic. Okay, should be this one. Yes. Okay, looks like yes. For some reason, we won't be able to move to a full screen, but anyway, hopefully those from a distance should be able to see it anyway. Okay, Seraphim already said it all, so what I'm going is far too generous as usual. So I'm supposed to be active in both social movements and networks. I don't have any particular direct expertise of research in unions. I got so I could say sort of occasional interest, but I think not as a citizen, I think is a very important topic, obviously, but it's more, let's say, as a researcher, I haven't paid an immense amount of attention, apart from perhaps a paper I published in a collective book edited by Claudius Wagemann and Jürgen Grete a few years ago on social movements, unionism. And that gave me the idea, stimulus to think a little bit further. The data, fundamentally, they are what I would like. Today, I like to split it in 4 parts. First of all, I like to set a little, elaborate slightly on what Seraphim said, the distinction between these different versions of unionism and union mobilization. And then I will address the issue of embeddedness, but also the issue of whether there has been a change in individual behavior, whether both among people who are sympathizers or members of unions and other types of people who are not, regarding basic forms of political participation. And as you know, in the literature, there is a decades-long discussion. I mean, sociological literature, not social movements particularly, about whether we should look at phenomena in terms of categories, namely the characteristics of the actors and how they change, or to put it very simplistically, in terms of relations, where the starting point is not so much, not only if the characteristics of the actors, individuals or organizations change, but whether the pattern of connection between them changes. And these are 2 different ways of looking at a change, which I think may be also usefully applied in relation to the unions. And what I will actually try to do in a very, if you want, Solomonic way is to not to take side from one, but to try to see try to pick insights from both approaches. And the way in which I will do that is I will use the 5 available waves of the European Value Survey, the first one taken in the early 80s and the last just at the end of the decade, the previous decade. So they span a considerable amount of time. There is a note of warning that we might be useful to mention right away. Some people might object that, okay, what these surveys do, they ask people about involvement in certain categories of activities. You know you're familiar with the battery of items, question whether they are members of unions or voluntary cultural associations, religious groups, and so on and so forth. And some people would tell you, I have faced this type of remark before. People might suggest that, yes, okay, you're asking the same thing, but the unions have changed, so basically you can't compare unions, what unions were in the 80s, what unions were in the 2000s, you can't compare, which is a valid point up to a certain point. So it's a limitation of the study. At the same time, if we follow this line, it seems to me we could be forgetting about an immense amount of social science research. We should get rid entirely of any kind of analysis which pretends aspires to map change over time based on any kind of systematic investigation, sampled population. The same thing, the question, the same criticism could be made against the very famous value batteries measured by Hinger, because yet again, prioritizing personal safety means one thing now, which is probably very different to what 40 years ago. So this is a kind of disclaimer, but let's go to the substance. The argument here, I call organizational unionism, and I do that following the terminology I used in my book, The Cement of Civil Society, in my model of modes of coordination of collective action. It's basically a style of representing interest, which is centered, focused very much about the role of organizations, formal organizations, their strategies, their priorities, their reference to a specific constituency, as opposed instead of a style of action which is explicitly incorporates, includes, accepts massive alliance with other parties, massive interaction, massive efforts to identify common goals and possibly to share broader collective identities. Following a model of this kind, I suggested precisely that decisions are taken primarily within the boundaries of each organization, decisions about how to use the available resources. And also the loyalties and identities are defined primarily in relation to the organization as such and to the specific section of class or of trade that they want to represent, rather than making broader statements about class or other collectivities at large. So the most extreme version of this has been defined business unionism, in which precisely the union acts exclusively as an entrepreneur, particular kind of entrepreneur that represents its own members and treated more or less as targets of services, treating political representation as a kind of a particular type of service. If you want to stress the image, thinking of members as clients, leaders as service providers, and basically fundamentally paying little attention to either to other subsectors of class or even members of the same sector of class that are basically not former members of the union. So it's a kind of representation which is very focused on the members. There are other versions of it which I would suggest which are more inclusive. I would say that empirically we can find within what has been called social movement, social democratic unionism, we can find elements of that in which, in this case, the focus may not be exclusively on subsectors of class, but it can be on working class perhaps in a broader sense, but in which the representation is precisely primarily focused on workers and possibly with extensive solid relation to traditional social democratic party. The same a pattern of interest representation, which is very much focused on the relation between parties and unions at the most. Possibly, as it was certainly the case in Italy, I suspect that the case here as well, possibly with the different shifting the different combination of partnerships depending on the orientation of a specific union. As you know, the traditional standard classic unions in Italy, the three major historical unions were particularly strong relations to different parties. In one case, the Christian Democratic Party, in another case, the Communist and Socialist Party, yet in another case, more, let's say, non-secular secular parties, and more moderate like the Republican Party. I mean, there was a complex pattern of relationship. But anyway, with attention to specific parties. Social movement unionism, by contrast, has been an idea that, as far as I understand, started developing in the global south between the 70s and the 80s, but then it spread all over the place. And reflects fundamentally, first of all, as already Sarafin pointed out, ties between unions and other types of associations, other types of organization, community groups, but also possibly, you mentioned them, and representatives of other types of movements, non-class-based movements, and cultural association, any huge variety of groups that could be brought into cooperation with the union in order to expand their appeal, expand the range of connections. And this is more approximate, even though the extent changes substantially in specific cases. This is more approximate what I would call a social movement mode of coordination that seems to me characterized precisely by the fact that there is a multiplicity of diversity. This diversity is explicitly recognized, but at the same time there is an effort both to consult and work together as much as possible in promoting joint initiatives, so in sharing resources for action, but also in trying to develop some kind of, no matter how much vague definition of reality of the collectivity goes beyond specific classes, it embraces a larger. The most extreme case would be we the 99%, using this type of encompassing rhetoric. So those are the different. Why? And this is the first part that Sarafin mentioned. The second notion is embeddedness. Now, embeddedness, I take it in broad terms. I would say my references have been mostly social movement theory, and some have been and some insight from development in industrial relations you refer to as power resource theory, which has a pretty consistent basic insights, and they're fairly two are not identical, but they certainly share some points. Fundamentally, the argument is not limited to this. Honestly, is much more general. It's the idea that somehow the power of an organization or a set of organizations depends also on their ability, their capacity, the opportunity to shape a public discourse, to create a framing of social movements. A scholar would use the term framing, to frame issues and problems in such a way that enables to bring together, build coalitions, and to spread and legitimize the ideas of the movement, the ideas even beyond these boundaries, even beyond this. It's a set of closest members and sympathizers. So now, if you want to go to use more traditional languages, you could think capacity of the union to have some kind of hegemonic project of society. This was a word very popular in the good old times of the 70s. It's probably not a realistic, it's not been a realistic goal in the recent years, to put it very mildly. But anyway, so the idea, this is the fundamental idea that I would pass. Now, about 20 years ago, two American sociologists published a paper which has been pretty influential, certainly on me, even though I didn't work on unions. It's probably be much less influential than it would deserve to be. And their point was very simple. They were noticing what was largely accepted as a matter of fact, the slow decline in the influence of unions over American politics that we started back from the 50s to the 60s, down on their data covered until the 1990s. And they were able to rely on data from the General Social Survey, which are taken yearly, on a yearly basis. And they showed, and they associated the reduction of the influence to a phenomenon that they could trace to the survey data, namely precisely that showing that unions were less embedded, in the sense that there were two parallel mechanisms. On the one hand, union members were less involved in other associations, or in a smaller range of other associations. But also, in parallel, the other measure was the fact that the extent to which the proportion of members of other associations that were also members of unions is not exactly the same. I mean, how many within the unions, what the propensity of the unions to engage as outside, but also the ability, the extent to which unions could attract people who were active in other organizations. Depend clearly, the size of those other groups would affect the level of connectivity. Exactly, two-way street. And the fundamental, and then you will see that the patterns were actually different. The bottom line was, assumption was what I just mentioned, that multiple association membership should have enhanced the strength of the union. Okay. Now, in order to, their analysis was focused on the global amount of other memberships. Here, I draw a difference. I differentiate between what are basically three. It's a classical partition that you find in most analyses of participation in associations conducted using survey data, fundamentally. And I differentiate between three forms. What I call it's a cliche. I don't like it particularly anyway. For the sake of simplicity, old, into inverted commas, politics, namely established interest organizations focus on the repression of interest, political parties, unions, professional associations on the one hand. Then new politics organizations mobilized on collective interests such as the environment, human rights, peace, women, etc. But then there is also the third element, which is socio-cultural associations, which include, in a sense, it's a residual category, includes organizations that are not, they can play a role or occasion, but generally speaking are not perceived as being primarily focused on issues of political representation and advocacy, namely from religious groups to educational cultural associations, sports clubs, organizations, voluntary organizations working on welfare, I mean, a broad range, which also make it, honestly, more difficult to interpret when it comes to formulate specific hypotheses, because precisely it's a category which is so extensive that it's difficult to make, to associate to the discussion we had before between the possible shifts from a business logic of unionism to another logic, because there are so, for example, in any category could really cover all sorts of very different types of collective action. So it's more difficult to interpret. But anyway, the first what I tried to do first of all was to formulate some expectation regarding how the idea, the possibility that we were moving from a, or say, traditional unionist logic toward the social movement logic might try to translate into expectation. And at one level, the first level to investigate is whether there has been a change, a shift in the involvement of union members in traditional political parties, other kinds of professional associations, etc. Or if conversely, following this logic, we say there should be a relative reduction of the strength of also the ability of unions. If unions were more interested, focused, or shifting the focus towards civil society in general, one might, for example, want to check empirically whether this implies a smaller, more limited, more partial, or less reduced attractivity towards what are supposed to be the traditional partners, the conversationists of the unions. Okay, so from this point of view, the question was whether over time there was a sort of a lower in the exchange between these different types of these different types of associations, other political parties. Conversely, if the social movement unionism was actually a process in process, one would expect possibly union members to become more involved in what I call the new politics organizations, or vice versa, and vice versa. New politics, you might expect to find a higher proportion of members of more politics organizations being active into union, engaging more with unions. Okay. Now, in this regard, the data that I'm going to show, first of all, as a general point, we can say that data suggests that actually there has been a rise, and a rise which is very similar in all the three countries that I'm going to look at. Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you. I'm looking at three cases, I'm sorry, which is Germany, Italy, and Great Britain. I pick those three cases because they can be reasonably taken as examples of structurally different polities, political systems which differ in significant ways in their relation to to unions, in the way they treat collective conflicts, and they treat collective representation. They relate to representatives of collective interests and so forth. Unsurprisingly, Germany is usually been in the literature regarded as a country scoring very high in terms of corporatist patterns of interest representation. Great Britain and the other opposite has been regarded as an example of neoliberalism, pronounced example. Italy is a more tricky, is a more complex case because depending some consider it closer to a corporatist model, but it's clearly not by no means comparable to the German model. It can be considered as an intermediate, let's say, a situation somewhere falls in between the two. And actually, for those who have, when there have been attempts to develop indexes based on sets of indicators, an index of corporatism, actually, Italy finds itself in an intermediate position. It's an intermediate position because on the one hand, unions have had also with stronger relations to mostly, even though not exclusively, to oppositional parties, and to some extent also to the Christian Democratic Party, but these have never developed in corporatist arrangements like the one that we saw in Germany. Anyway, what I'm going to show is not all the tables that are, and all the figures, sorry, that I'm going to show are simply do not reflect percentage distribution. They are the result of simple regression which are only factored in the time dimension. So there's indication of whether there's been a change over time and whether the change has been pronounced in one or the other countries. Broadly speaking, we can say, seems reasonable to say, argue that I could show you all the table with the different percentages, but it would be terrible to watch. I wouldn't have time to do. It would be basically impossible to handle anyway. What we can say is that generally speaking, over the year there seems to be a steady growth of propensity of union members to engage in others. In other types of organizations, but and this in overall in very similar ways in the three countries. However, if we look at there are substantial differences. For example, this regards reflects membership involvement in other types of political organizations. So the basic pattern. In this sense, there has not been an immense amount. There have been a variation, oscillations, if you want. If any, there have been, yeah, one could argue there has been a slightly more modest tendency, more stronger in Italy and most limited in Germany. The green dotted line at the bottom, but the overall impression is there is no very clear indication of a massive change in that regard. This phenomenon is, again, broadly speaking, very similar pattern can be found if you look at the issue from the other perspective, namely the propensity of people who are members of other associations of various kind to engage at the same time in unions. If you contrast the two, yeah, there is a difference a slight difference between the first and the second wave of the South, basically between the start of the 80s and the start of the 90s. You see, there's a more pronounced rise, but generally speaking, the pattern yet again is a pattern, I would suggest, of oscillation rather than suggesting a profound change. the picture is quite different if you look, as you can see, new politics. Actually, there is quite clear, quite evident tendency for growth in all over time in all the countries. Yet again, Italy is the one where the process is most pronounced. This time is Britain where there is slightly less pronounced, but we can certainly agree that the overall pattern is pretty much shared across the pattern. What however is more problematic, and this, so certainly this, I mean, this is a partial evidence, just a suggestion rather than a strong proof. But what this suggests is actually something that, at least from the point of view of Union, certainly an inclination, orientation towards engaging more with other kind of subjects. The other way around is less convincing, because as you can see, in this case, the appeal. In this case, what this shows is the appeal of unions to people who are active in other kind of organizations. In this case, the appeal is fairly limited. Of course, we should one would need to factor in information like the problem. One should share also for the problem contraction of the workforce, so the transformation in the job market, etc., the reduction in the number of people active. But whatever the case, people who are active in new politics organizations seem to be not particularly, let's say, to the contrary. I mean, they don't show any kind of propensity to engage more with unions. If anything, this is slightly decreasing. I didn't formulate, for the reason that I was telling you, any specific hypothesis regarding the social cultural organization, which are pretty heterogeneous, but nevertheless, the overall data for what it is worth is this. Yet again, data suggests a very strong propensity of union members to engage also in other types of associations, and likewise, as it happens in this sense, the pattern is pretty close to what we found for new politics organizations. If you look at the other pattern, a growth between the 81 and the 1990s, those who incidentally were periods in which of particularly pronounced innovation in terms of forms of political representation beyond the traditional parties and unions. But apart from that, the pattern is very similar. So far, so bad, or better, so bad. So uncertain. The picture clearly, the picture is not. There's no, I would say, very clear evidence of a radical shift. That then perhaps we might discuss whether this expectation was reasonable or not. But I mean, so far the picture is there are some signs that point towards the thesis, and other signs that point in a quite different direction. So this is so far for the argument of embeddedness. Now the next, consistent with what I said about the hope to combine relational, categorical perspectives, let's look instead at in a categorical way at the relationship of union members and non-union members with protest. And in this sense, one could, let's say, the argument on the one hand, the argument, the social movement unionism argument would lead people to expect, would lead us to expect union members to be more involved in a broader range of unconventional protest, beyond the strike. Okay. But on the other hand, and this would suggest precisely the idea that unions are exchanges, sharing practices with other social groups, and we are contrasting this with the traditional argument that say that the union use the strike and negotiation with bosses or possibly with government, but don't doubt going too far in the spread of their activities. And on the other hand, evidence has been there has been also repeat. Can you see from? Well, people can see, but people here cannot see. So.
Carry on.
Okay, no, I don't want to spare. Okay, so basically there have also been arguments, including studies done by a colleague in Trento, Katia Pirati, about the spread or the distribution over time of events involving labor issues without however, any involvement of the unions. There have been arguments that ultimately the forms issues linked to working people, are actually increasingly mobilizing, taking part in activities, in either through association with very informal unions or through mobilizing on labor issues, but largely disregarding, largely detached, separated from certainly from traditional major unions. This is one of the favorite grounds for the spread of this kind of activism has been the whole sector of the growth of the service sector and the unqualified service sector, new logistics, or for example, have been mobilizations by people working in logistics and distribution of goods, etc. They've attracted quite a bit of attention in Italy, for example, and there is evidence that this phenomenon is not limited to Italy. So the idea is, on the one hand, checking whether union members have become more heterogeneous, open, diversified, more richer in their repertoires. On the other hand, expecting that also we should also be seeing, if the notion of social movement unionism was spreading, we should also be seeing a growth in activists mobilizing on labor issues detached from, without being members of union, and which is what I've tested. This is the first data. It certifies a growth more massive, significantly more massive in Italy, but the same pattern is also to be found in Britain, in Germany. A growth in an inclination to consider the openness to consider more involvement in more diverse. These are the range, the scale that is a 0-4. The measure is a 0-4 scale, which is it's a simple additive scale, taking into account whether people claim to be prepared to engage in four forms of contention, sit-ins, occupational buildings, and the like. Okay, so this is the possibility for union members to use this protest is more pronounced in Italy across the, but it grows not in a strong way as the inclination to relate to new politics organizations, but nonetheless in a quite decisive way. The pattern this partially overlaps with the pattern in the general population, but in the general population, the pattern is actually different. There was between the 80s and the 90s, again, a growth of sympathy among the general population for engagement with in this form, but which, however, seems to be at best stable, actually suggests a slow decline over the rest of the period. So this seems to be when we look at the general population, this seems to be a more moderate, more modest pattern. I suspect it would be even more pronounced if you took out union members from this particular figure. What is, I think, very interesting, I think, is this particular figure, which shows the propensity to labor active, namely the indicator was constructed people who were not members of any interest representation groups, okay, but they claim to have participated in strikes, non-official strikes, which is the question in the out of the four questions. That is the question we are focused here, and this suggests a significant rise again in all countries, and yet again more pronounced in Italy, but similar with very similar trends. Now, what would be so that's the second element of the puzzle. Involvement in associations on one hand, availability to engage, even so, to engage in protest even from people who are not members. Now, the third element was whether this was consistent, the pattern was consistent or non-consistent in different countries. And in this sense, we would come up to two very elementary arguments. One is the argument that assumes, I would say, a linear relationship, suggesting that the propensity to engage in more kind of open, broader social movement, unionism, involving expressing also a stronger, broader social critique, adopting, carrying with it also the assumption of the adoption of more radical practices, etc., will be stronger in the stronger the neoliberal profile of a certain political system. So in this sense, we should expect a linear relationship from Germany showing a minimal propensity to the UK showing a maximal propensity, being extremely liberal country. Or we can suggest a curvilinear interpretation, namely suggests that ultimately the propensity for social movement unionism should be stronger in countries which combine some elements of a corporate system and some elements of but neoliberal or anyway less more deregulated or less system in which unions are less embedded and less consolidated as in Germany, like Italy. Now, if we don't have the think it is worse, but if we went back to all the different figures, what they do suggest is ultimately that the country with more pronounced trends and more pronounced orientation towards the unionism seems to be Italy by this token. Whereas, generally speaking, barring a few one exception, the trend seems to be more modest, shift between Germany and the UK. Let's say. In some cases, Germany, the country where the tendency seems more limited. In other cases, is the UK. So, all in all, I would suggest that in this regard, this presence is more, this tendency is more pronounced in Italy, which doesn't mean it doesn't have nothing to do with the overall pure presence, the amount of people, organizations that may be inclined to active movements. This suggests trends in relation to in relation to the size and the profile of the specific local civil societies. Okay. Again, as I said, just to sum up, I think we can go to a conclusion. Just as I was hinting before, just to summarizing, there is mixed support about the arguments. Mixed support in the sense there is indication, as I said, regarding the unions' growing involvement. Yes, unions are more involvement in the politics organization, but as we saw, the opposite, the ability of unions to attract from other sectors is quite limited. At the same time, there is no clear, evident trend towards the reduction of the share of the involvement of union members in traditional parties, etc. So in this sense, the impression, rather than a decline in traditional forms of involvement, there seems to be greater diversification of this involvement, greater availability to interest in playing, differentiating the connections of movements. And ultimately, it seems to me, but you might disagree, but it seems to me that this might still be broadly compatible with the social movement unionism argument. In a sense, I had as a hypothesis, I frame it in very drastic terms, the expectation should be that there will be less involvement in unions, in parties over the years. But also, what we find is that still the parties are still a relevant partner for unionists, but this also the profile of their participation is broader. It becomes broader and more diversified. There are exactly. Actually, this was the other side of the story. It depends how we interpret it. There is no strong indication that. As I said, the question is how do we interpret the fact that the appeal of unions in their traditional milieux has not dramatically gone down. Here we have there is no clear evidence that unions are attracting significantly less than in the past people from parties. And likewise, I mean, in this sense, the overall attractiveness towards other sectors in society seems to be problematic. What I think really, it's really probably more. What is, however, the most interesting finding, I think, is the other one. If we define, and so this goes in many ways challenges, or at least requires us to put the embeddedness argument into perspective. The fact that ultimately there is a quite clear trend in being more differentiating the repertoires and differentiating also in the growth of the people without any organizational embeddedness actually get mobilized around labor issues. And this, I think, is the more interesting element of the story. Okay, I already mentioned this. This is the comparative element that I already mentioned. Changes in behavior and changes in union involvement are more significant in Italy as a mixed system. Germany supports the argument about the linear hypothesis, but Britain does not support this argument. We should expect more radical grassroots action and more social movement unions in Britain if the linear hypothesis was to hand. Where do we go from now? I would say we should note that the argument we might want to test the argument embeddedness actually facilitates union influence. The paradox is I took it for granted, and also the original paper ultimately took it for granted. So the argument, what they did in the original paper, was not to correlate exactly measures of influence of the unions. They focused on the evolution over time of the extent of multiple associational membership, but there was less attention, if you want, to battery of measures that actually suggested that unions' influence was ultimately smaller, because there could be arguments that for example, might lead you to expect that unions might be stronger if maybe they are less connected to the rest of society, but are connected to a particularly mobilized, are capable of connected to a smaller group, providing more incentives to act, more incentives to radicalization. So in some cases, a closer, more tightly connected sector of society could be capable of mounting an opposition, opposition and a challenge which turns out to be more effective. So the issue of, as we know, the issue of the relationship between levels of collective action and influence is disputed, very, very complicated, and this is something that it might be worth checking. Now, the other thing is that it will be interesting to see more specifically whether people that are non-unionized but are actively interested in acting over labor conflict, they are also prepared directly to engage in other types of protest, not in association, because for that we have the data, but also in various forms of protest alongside. The difference, I'm mentioning that precisely because what comes out from this data, among is the hypothesis that we might be seeing the emergence of, can we call them community of protest or activist militants, who are not linked to any particular formal union, but they connect to other means, for example, the internet or other types of connectivity. And it will be interesting to see if these people are also involved in other types of protests. Because how do they link protest? And I had in 2003, unfortunately, the data from the value survey do not provide this type of information. They reported people are involved in protest in general, and they mention strikes, that therefore informal, unofficial strikes, that therefore from which you can extract a response to our particular problem, but they don't tell you whether people participate in environmental protests or in peace protests or whatever. The question is not trivial, because when you have those data, you find the patterns which are not necessarily overlapping. In 2003, Stefan Varga and Dieter Ruth promoted, Donatella Della Porte and I participated for Italy in a project where we distributing questionnaire between people going to the mass big anti-war demonstration. We're talking about the attack on Iraq. Okay, and in that context, it emerged quite clear that there were, on the one hand, people who were actually involved in association, but on the other hand, there were people who were not necessarily involved in association, but were regular participants in a number of different types of protests. Protest on new social movement issues, protest around women's issue, protest around labor as well. So that, for example, that showed that people active in protests, but not in association, for example, there were most people active in continuously in peace-related protests were not members of peace associations, for example. So and then generally speaking, there were countries like Britain and USA where members of peace association were central in this network. There were in the other countries, there was more people were protesting peace, but not active in peace associations. There were interesting patterns to explore. Now, the style, as you know, the style of distributing questionnaires among participants in demonstration has become more popular. Actually, now we have available. Klanderman's coordinated about 10 years ago a massive series of protests. There are available data that perhaps might be usefully explored from this, having in mind this particular angle. They wouldn't be up to date, but they would be perhaps able to share also some more insight. I did some exercise in that direction, and something might come out also from this particular angle. And I think I can stop here, more or less. Yeah. Thank you.
Mario?
Shall I leave the?
You might, even though. Okay. Okay. As always, it's a very, very sophisticated and rather complex presentation. Mario always makes it sound simple. He's a low-key speaker, but I think it provides grounds if you look carefully at the data presented. I have a couple of questions, and of course, I'm not 100% sure that I'm in control of all the data presented. People can go back and see the argument. But I think the data provided allow us to draw the outline of a quite fascinating story, which comes out in support of social movement unionism. The outlines, of course, and I mean, we would have to shift attention, sort of piecing together certain elements. One cannot be 100% sure of course, but I think there's a general trend. This may perhaps be going beyond the paper, but if you piece out certain conclusions, some of them tentative, from going through the hypotheses I presented. You've given us 8 hypotheses, right? I haven't had the chance to look at the paper. The paper is about to be published, so I haven't seen the actual text, but on the basis of the PowerPoint presentation. So, as I said at the beginning, it gives us food for thought. And I think that in a nutshell, I think that outline of this presentation, I hope people can hear me, because we can't hear each other here over the internet, but I see people smiling, so I gather that people can hear us over the internet. I think that, and that's beyond doubt, I would say, that social movement unionism, or at least features associated with social movement unionism, are being sought after by many people, especially the militancy involved, like non-conventional protest activities, which I think, as I said at the beginning, I think is a feature we should include in the defining properties of social movement unionism. Like, it's not just the organizational or the collective action field-related aspects, but also this political aspect. In fact, in other words, they are prepared to engage in militant action, whatever that means. But we all have an idea. And the same goes, by the way, with business unionism. It's not just I think the collective action field, but also the politics associated with it. Like, it's a very conventional politics linked sometimes with managerial prerogatives and so on. Anyway, I think the presentation allows us to detect or suggest that it's out there, that there's an all-out effort, shall I describe it, by people to break loose from conventional politics, like the politics as practiced by the old bureaucratized parties, the social democratic parties of the so-called center-left, and also the bureaucratic practices of the major established unions. So the way I'm thinking to go about making this is to try to verbalize, spell out some of the things that I saw through going through the results from the hypothesis. So what I've done is like taken down the hypotheses and tried to sort of suggest tentative, shall I say, conclusions or thoughts that pop up once one sees these conclusions, like which of the hypotheses are being verified, where you find strong links, what does it tell us, and the opposite, when the hypothesis doesn't pop up. Hypothesis number one, which says that union members tend to be less involved in old politics organizations, which holds, right? If I'm right, it's true. It's not particularly strong, perhaps, but it is a tendency. Like union members tend to be less involved in old politics organizations. That would be sort of a way to render hypothesis number one, right? And I think that this is being verified by the data. I mean, may not be particularly strong correlation, but it's there. So one obvious conclusion, also again is a hypothesis we may be thinking about, is that this reflects it's a function of the bureaucratization of parties and their political retreat from union cause. In other words, union members don't see any reason to participate in political organizations, even though they may be prepared to politicize their struggle. They don't see traditional political parties as a vehicle for attaining that goal. Now, hypothesis number two says that all politics organizations, all politics organization membership tends to be less involved in unions. And there you say that it is not strong. Hypothesis number two is not being verified. So that tells us the opposite about what we said before about the disrepute of parties. Also goes as disrepute for unions. Like the same also holds true for party members. You say like, okay, we don't do anything, but do unions do anything? Like or traditional unions? So that would be an interesting story. Like you have a mutual lack of confidence in each other, which may be considered as part of the same story, actually, the same narrative. Like you have bureaucratized unions and bureaucratized parties that have no respect for each other. Now, hypothesis number three says that union members tend to be more involved in new politics organizations, or social movements, in other words. There is this predisposition, and you do find support for that. So in relation to hypothesis number one, where union members are not predisposed to engage in the activities of political parties, all the same, that shows that they are not being depoliticized because they are prepared to engage in activities beyond conventional politics. They're seeking a new politicization. That is why, although they are not interested in joining the activities of traditional old politics, political parties in that sense, they are prepared to engage in the activities of new organizations. I don't know if that includes communitarian activities, but certainly it must include environment, human rights, peace, and so on. Okay, that's part of that other stories. In other words, this lack of confidence in traditional politics does not mean lack of politicization. Shows like a desire to discover other venues for expressing this need to politicize demands, grievances, what have you. Now, hypothesis 4 says that new politics organization members tend to be more involved in unions. Again, it's a no. Hypothesis number 4 is not verified, which in line with hypothesis number 2, whereupon all politics members have no special confidence in unions. Same holds true for new politics organizations which have no confidence in unions as well, which is anathema for unions, obviously. 5 and 6 is about, predisposition to act in a militant way, go beyond traditional, forms of protest. So, I mean, if we think, as I think we should, that such a drive to adopt militant, tactics is a feature of social movement unionism, perhaps the $1 million question would be whether this is likely to change the profile of bureaucratic unions towards a more social movement direction. Since the union members are predisposed to act in militant ways. But because unions and traditional political organizations are not, they do not have the tendency to join in their activities, but they do have the tendency to act in ways that are militant. And that holds true also for disembedded people. I think that's particularly interesting. The fact that you have this preponderance to act in militant ways, even among people who are not unionized or members of parties or other organizations. And this, in my view, reflects the perma crisis, as I put it at the beginning. You have a widespread tendency to seek collective action repertoires that are not of the conventional type. Having drawn the conclusion that this doesn't work, it's never enough, which is also a sign of politicization, of a new politicization emerging, seeking new forms of organizational expression. Now, about the hypothesis 7 and 8, the more original, I was not fully clear because you said that such militant action is more likely in neoliberal setting at one point, and at another point you said that sometimes it's higher in Germany, sometimes it's higher in Britain. One would imagine that it would be consistently higher in Britain, given that Britain is the neoliberal pole and Germany the more corporatist pole. Maybe you can clarify this. But it's very interesting that you have, the fact that Italy tops the list, being the mixed case. But I think the factor there which plays a role is history, militant traditions, traditional politicization, and maybe the country to study in more depth, perhaps in order to discover all the features that play a role in this particular dynamic, this preponderance, this tendency to associate with new versus old politics groups and so on. And it may also be a function of the depth of the crisis and the extent of social dislocation. I haven't been able to sort of see that in your data on Germany, but Germany, as you put it, at some point things change in time, obviously. Germany in the past used to be a model of, how was it called? Embedded capitalism, or the social democratic, welfare state, and a particular kind which is no longer there. So maybe things are changing there rapidly. And it would also be very interesting to, if we were able to do that, focus in different periods in time and see how all these links change. Because I imagine that, as you put it at the beginning of the presentation, this thing starts to become manifest since the 80s. I mean, right, I mean, before that we didn't have any real dilemma. But it's not only that you have the emergence of new social movements and new politics and social movement unionism, but also the fact that you have the crisis, the political crisis of traditional political organizations and the bureaucratization of unions. Anyway, these are very tentative conclusions, but I think that if one went through each and every one of the hypotheses and tried to suggest explanations for the results, I think that they would coalesce into offering us a pretty coherent narrative about what is happening. So I think this is a very important contribution, and I hope you continue looking into it. Oh, well, that will be all on my part. I don't know if we have questions in this audience or online. Your way?
Yes.
There is George. Right.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That's good.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mario Diani, for this presentation, which was really instructive and thought-provoking in many aspects. I would like to see more and read more about social embeddedness in this work. I think it's a very interesting proposal to put into work this concept of embeddedness. A brief question: could you please show us again the variation of the involvement of trade union members in old in parties, in political parties, in old politics? So the variation of the participation of trade union members in old politics. I think it was one of the first slides showing graphs. Ah, great. Yes, that's it. Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I was surprised by two things, and I would like your opinion on that. It seems as if variation in Great Britain is lower than in Italy, for example, and I would be expecting the opposite, that the membership of trade unionists in the United Kingdom would be stronger than in Italy, because of the institutional background of the British trade unions and their relationship to the Labour Party. And the second is that the fact that the institutional arrangements between the British Labour Party and the trade unions that have changed within the previous decade. For example, in 2014, we had some changes, some shifts within the Labour Party internal procedures. And I don't know if these shifts are actually, depicted into these graphs, into this variation And if not, which I can't see any impact of these institutional changes and shifts, how would you explain this?
So I'm asking other people if you have any other questions in the room. No, we don't have any other question in the room. Okay, go right ahead.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Can I start from the last, Yorgos? The thing, what these data show, it's a bit, I didn't explain it quite clearly, and what the data show is...
Before you go on, I also wanted to say that my comment was on the aggregate data, because I don't see any basic differences. So if you want to expand on this, that would be another opportunity.
These data must give, they don't refer to the overall size of the union members of these associations in different countries. Simply the variation in the extent to which they engage with other kinds of association. So what is showed in the column on the side is not the percentages that the people that in Italy or in England or in Germany actually are involved, or people with those characteristics are actually involved in other types of associations. This is not shown in the vertical axis tells you the probability that this happens, and the impact that the time dimension is on the probability. So it was as is the same. Imagine that the horizontal axis was, let's say, income, and you had in the vertical axis a measure, for example, of interest in classical music. Okay, and you would find, in this case, you would expect a growth, a linear growth across levels of income, suggesting showing the correlation with the classical music, but you would have exactly in this sense, you would measure the impact of different levels of income over the other one. So here you see the impact of time over the extent to which. So it's a bit, in this sense, confusing. You're right, the level is high. It's a surprise. I mean, I have no answer. It's a good question what you posed about the other question. I mean, I have no particular answer. What strikes me in this data is precisely what you pointed out, that there seems to be happened over time a very strong disconnection between the unions and labor, at least political parties in general. And this is bizarre. I can tell you, however, what I also did, and perhaps what I also did, I looked at these 14 different, 10 to 14 different types of associations that are measured in the different ways of the European Value Survey. And I built networks not between the specific actors, between the types. And these networks are based basically on the number of people who are active in both. Okay. Well, I mean, weighted by the size of these groups. But what you see, if you, I think I can show you because I've got it in another paper. I will try later to trace it, but anyway, it's too complicated for the time being. But anyway, what comes out is actually the fact that even if you treat data in that way, unions in Britain are linked mostly to seem to be linked mostly to socio-cultural associations, not to parties. We need to take into account the fact that the category of parties is broader, also includes parties that traditionally are not linked to unions, but nevertheless, you're right. I would have expected that given union people who are members of unions in Britain should be in a reasonable sides be linked to other. Either the data are completely wrong, but if the European Value Survey is wrong, then we are in serious trouble, generally speaking, in our use of surveys. But this is certainly an element which is valuable. I lived in Britain. I could respond to you in an anecdotal way. There were certainly signs already when I was working there and doing my project on local civil society that the relationship with unions were variable at best. I found it to be strong in Glasgow. I found it to be the relation between unions and unions were linked. There were signs of social movement unionism in a city like Glasgow. There was much less than that in a city like Bristol that I also studied. Was a very complex figure. But generally speaking, the link is, I think this points at the fact that there is a problem that the overlap between class unions and party has largely gone, and which brings us to the thinking.
But time plays. Turn off your microphone. What I meant to add was that time plays a key role because things change very dramatically. Like it was a different picture during Corbyn. It's a very different picture now. Party influence changes, predisposition to engage in union work changes, the links between unions and party change. Time is obviously a factor here. So I say that because you raised your doubts about the validity of data. But data would have to be more fine-tuned in order to draw any set conclusions about this particular question.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on this ground. There is one has to be very much aware of the limitations of this study as well of any study. What I'm saying is what I think this study suggests is, I'm not sure about the interpretation. You suggested that the involvement in all politics has gone down. I'm not quite sure about that. Data suggests rather some switches, but not a clear. It don't show a clear-cut trend like the one that you can see in terms of propensity going over time to engage with new politics organizations. That kind of you don't really quite. I would say the jury is still out with relation to the overall relationship between parties and the unions, because in the same network that I was mentioning, talking to Yorgos, in the networks for Germany and also Italy ultimately show that when in aggregate terms the strongest overlap, the strongest relationship still between parties and unions. So it's a kind of unions are still linked to parties with some insight opening towards more social cultural associations than others, but it's a different logic of measuring the connection. So it's not doesn't look at individual behavior, but it aggregates the behavior of several individuals in a measure. So, and of course, all measures are subject to their own internal variability, and we know that. So all I'm saying, I would say the data suggests to open up, as you say, possibly if you want to say, you might say a can of worms, but on the other hand, they open up questions like the one you raised. I mean, it's a skeleton. It's a skeleton, and the validity of the skeleton, I think, is not to tell the whole story or to provide a full picture, but it is to bring together behaviors which come from a diverse set of people and try to figure out basic patterns, and then on top of that, the richness of the interpretation requires requires more specific work, etc., which is luckily for me is beyond the length of the standard 7,000-8,000 words academic paper. But sorry, I think the goal of this exercise is not to provide an explanation, but it is to suggest a puzzle, suggest a picture which meets some expectations, doesn't meet in full other expectations, and to see if anybody is willing to build on that.
Okay. Of course, you are the judge of your data, but I did say that all we can hope for is sort of provide the elements of an outline. So I'm not saying that it's a clear-cut interpretation, but I think the challenge on the basis of this data, which is quite telling. I mean, doesn't give us everything, but it's considerable. A number of important findings. So the way one pieces them together is always a sort of a big challenge. But we may formulate more hypotheses for more robust explanatory propositions in the future. So it's an open question. Well, thanks everybody. Thank you, Mario, for this presentation. Gives us food for thought. And I hope this hybrid form has performed so far. So thanks everyone.
Thank you very much.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.